Hi, we're going to talk about regulation of blood pressure. You should be familiar with the basics of blood pressure from watching the previous video that Dr. Mashburn recorded. So I'm not going to go deep into the discussion of what blood pressure is, just to give you a few reminders and then talk about some of the factors that do help to regulate blood pressure. And also, hopefully, after you have watched this video, you'll understand the role of salt in the regulation of blood pressure. So, let me get my pen rocking here, and we'll go back, and just wanted to point that salt out to you. All right, so let's talk now about blood pressure. All right, so blood pressure, of course, is one of the vital signs that you will be assessing in your healthcare professions. Vital signs such as pulse and blood pressure, rate of respirations, skin conditions, and body temperature are going to give you some ideas of what's going on with your patient. Now, your patient is going to be describing things that are happening to them, and those are known as symptoms. Your vital signs are what you are going to actually see. Those are the measurements and the observations you take. So signs you see, symptoms are what your patient says. Okay, so just a reminder, pulse, of course, being the wave of pressure that's caused as blood is pumped through those vessels. So you will be assessing pulse usually along with your blood pressure. So I wanted to remind you of some of the more common places that pulse measurements are taken. And the most common, of course, is the radial pulse. You should be familiar with radial. That's going to refer to the radius, okay? So the radial pulse, of course, is going to be taken near the wrist. But just so that you're aware, there are several other places that you can take a pulse reading as well. The temporal artery and facial artery, of course, one of the more common is going to be the carotid artery. The brachial artery, you will utilize the movement of blood through the brachial artery in your measurement of blood pressure. The radial artery, of course, being the more common place to take a pulse, to feel for a pulse. The femoral artery, and yes, that is pointing to the femur and not the penis. Not really good positioning of the arrow there, though, right? Popliteal artery, you should know from the term where to find that. And then, of course, two that are important when there is a break in the leg are the posterior tibial and the dorsalis pedis artery. So you check those to make sure that you still have blood flow when a bone is broken in the leg, so that you can save those, restore the blood flow and save the lower portion of the limb and the foot if there has been damage to the blood vessel. All right, enough about that. Let's talk about blood pressure. Blood pressure, remember, is the pressure of the blood against the vessels in which it is flowing. Now, yes, I know you don't have this slide in your PowerPoints because I just stuck it in right before I made the recording, but there's not a lot for you to write on this, and besides, you know this anyway. So the blood pressure of the blood against the vessels, it's typically going to be expressed with two numbers. If you are doing an auscultation, you're going to be using this sphygmomanometer. There's that big old word again, right? If you're using the sphygmomanometer, the blood pressure cuff, and a stethoscope, you're going to get two readings. The systolic, or the upper number, the top number, is the pressure when it is greatest in the brachial artery as blood is ejected from those ventricles, or from the left ventricle. The diastolic number is going to be a lower number in most cases, and it's when the pressure is lowest in that vessel, and of course that's going to be between those ventricular contractions. So just to give you an example of what is typically considered a normal blood pressure, you'll have a systolic reading of 120 and a diastolic of 70/80. Now, hopefully you can tell me why that is not a complete blood pressure reading. Now, that's typically what you're going to see written, but it's not complete because there's no unit of measure. The unit of measure to make this complete is millimeters of mercury. Now, if you don't understand what that means, hopefully your instructor will explain it, because I don't want to make this a really long video. So moving on. All right, so things that are involved in the regulation of blood pressure, we want to begin by talking about things that are going to raise your blood pressure. So your body has determined that your blood pressure is low. So you're going to have baroreceptors. Baro, remember, means pressure, and receptor detects the stimulus. So you have baroreceptors that are located in the aorta and also in the carotid arteries. And these are going to detect changes in pressure. So they're either going to be stimulated more when the blood pushes harder against them, which indicates an increase in blood pressure, or stimulated less when there is less pressure against them. And these stimuli, of course, are then going to be sent to the brain for interpretation. So let's say that those baroreceptors have detected a decrease in stimulation, meaning a decrease in blood pressure. So your body is going to act to raise that blood pressure. Now, Dr. Mashburn told you about some of the mechanisms that are used for short-term control. Well, we want to talk a little bit more about how we utilize things for long-term control of blood pressure. Now, this is going to begin with our old friends epi and norepi. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system is going to be stimulated to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine that are going to result in vascular changes. Okay, those vascular changes are going to be that the blood vessels constrict. So they're going to cause the smooth muscle in the tunica media of the blood vessels to constrict, increasing the pressure, but they're also going to stimulate the SA node. You should be familiar with SA node from your cardiac conduction. So your sinoatrial node is going to be stimulated to fire faster. Okay, so that's going to increase your cardiac output. The second thing we want to mention here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about, is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is going to be secreted from your posterior pituitary gland when blood pressure needs to raise. Now, these two that we're going to talk about here, your antidiuretic hormone and your renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, are going to be involved in changing blood volume. So they're going to cause you to retain water, and by retaining water, that water will be resorbed back into the bloodstream. Blood volume goes up, therefore blood pressure goes up. So let's look at each one of these three mechanisms that we just talked about with just a little more detail and some pretty little pictures. All right, so first, let's talk about epi and norepi. All right, so here we have blood pumping out of the heart, going up into that aorta, and you have baroreceptors here in the aorta and also in the carotid arteries that are not being stimulated enough. Okay, so that stimulus, that signal, is going to be sent to your cardio-inhibitory and or cardio-acceleratory, in this case, centers that are located within your brain stem. So that cardio-acceleratory center is going to be the one called into action because your blood pressure has fallen. So the cardio-acceleratory center says, oh, pressure must be low, I need to do something. So your sympathetic nervous system is then going to dump out epinephrine and norepinephrine, which causes the two actions we just spoke of. One, we're going to have stimulation of the smooth muscle in your blood vessels to constrict. So you're increasing the pressure within those vessels. But also the epi and norepi are going to stimulate that SA node to fire faster, therefore increasing cardiac output, so there's more blood in those vessels, thereby increasing pressure. All right, next thing, whoa, wrong direction. Next thing we want to talk about is to elaborate just a little bit more on the kidney role in this whole concept. So let's look just briefly at what's going on first here, okay? So blood pressure has decreased. That could be because decreased extracellular fluid, decreased fluid in the blood. Your osmoreceptors and your baroreceptors detect that change, and it's going to stimulate a sensation of thirst. So how do you respond to that? You go get a drink of water. That water is then going to be resorbed through the gastrointestinal tract back into the bloodstream. The osmolality, which just means how much stuff is dissolved in the fluid, is going to decrease. The fluids in your body increase, so you have increased water in your extracellular spaces, you have increased water in your blood, and then you have the inhibition of those osmoreceptors. All right, same thing here. Remember, osmolality, how much stuff is dissolved in a solution. So if you've decreased the amount of water in a solution, the osmolality goes up, as does the osmotic pressure. So that's going to be stimulation sent to the brain interprets. Okay, so things start happening. Your saliva is drying up. You got that dry mouth. What are you going to do? Get a drink of water through the gastrointestinal tract and right back like we just saw. Now, the role of the kidneys in all of this is very important because what's the job of the kidney? Do you know? The job of your kidneys is not to produce urine. Your kidneys work to filter the blood. Urine is a byproduct that's created as the blood is filtered. So we filter out excess water, excess fluids, excess hormones. We filter out waste products. We filter out toxins. Okay, so the kidneys are just a filtering station, and what they do is to produce urine as a product of that. So you have blood, unfiltered blood, coming into the kidneys, goes through all of these vessels to get out to structures known as nephrons. Okay, so here you have a nephron. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. That's where the filtration takes place. That's the center of the action. So through the nephron, and the cleaned up blood, of course, is going to go back out through your renal vein back into circulation after it goes back up to the heart. You know that whole pathway. So let's look at this nephron for just a moment. You see the blood comes in, and it comes into this little ball here that's filled with blood vessels. And filtration occurs from those blood vessels into the little ball, which serves as a holder, like a capsule. Okay, then that filtrate is going to pass through all these kinked up little tubes, down through this big loopy thing here, into another kinky little tube, and then into this structure, which is a collecting duct. All right. The collecting duct is the last chance for us to get anything back, because if it stays in the collecting duct, it's eventually going to end up in the toilet. All right, so let's erase some of this. Let's just get rid of all of it. All right, so let's look now at these tubes again. Okay, here we have the tube closest to the filtration system. So that is your proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, proximal meaning closest to. Okay, down through here we have the loop of Henle. And then the distal convoluted tubule. And I'm just going to put CT there for convoluted tubule. All right, so as this filtrate is going through there, not all of the filtrate is going to end up in the toilet, because we're going to reclaim some of that filtrate. Now, I guess you're wondering what in the world all this has to do with blood pressure, right? No, I've not gone off on a tangent. I'm teaching you something important about how the kidneys are responsible for maintaining blood pressure. So these structures that we're talking about are very important to the hormones that we previously mentioned. All right, so if we switch to this picture, here's our little ball structure. Here's our proximal convoluted tubule, our distal convoluted tubule, and here's our collecting duct. Okay, the collecting duct is taking filtrate from several of those nephrons, so there'd be another nephron over here. Collecting duct collects all the filtrate. Okay, all right, so antidiuretic hormone is going to be secreted when we need to retain water. Now, related to blood pressure, when would we need to retain water? When blood pressure has fallen because blood volume has fallen. So we want to keep water so that it can be restored back into the bloodstream. So what antidiuretic hormone does is to cause holes to be poked in the tubes on the last part of the distal convoluted tubule, but also in the collecting duct. Now think about this. This tube is just like a water hose. If you poke holes in that water hose, some of the water leaks out, correct? It doesn't go out the end of the hose. All right, if you relate that to the kidney, The water hose is your nephron. The end of the hose is that collecting duct, and it's going to empty into the toilet. So if we want to save water, we've got to get it out of this structure. We've got to get it out of the nephron, get it out of the collecting duct. Because all around this nephron and the collecting duct, you've got a massive network of blood vessels just waiting to resorb whatever comes out of the tube back into the bloodstream. So as that water comes out of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, then we're producing less urine because less water is making it through the end. Over here, if you look on the left side, we don't have these holes poked in. So we're keeping all that fluid, all that filtrate, and we're producing large volumes of urine as compared to the small volume when we have those little holes. Those little holes are actually proteins that are called aquaporins. Now, you should be able to figure out what that means just by looking at the word. Aqua refers to water, and a pore is a hole. Okay, so antidiuretic hormone causes aquaporins to be embedded in the distal convoluted tubule and in the collecting duct. Therefore, water is retained. The water is retained, it's soaked up back into the bloodstream, blood volume goes up, therefore blood pressure goes up. See how easy that is? Pretty cool too, huh? All right, now the next one we want to mention that we talked about with raising blood pressure is the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone pathway. Now you know why sometimes it's called the RAA system. It's much easier to say, right? All right, so remember, we're still talking about raising blood pressure. So your kidneys are going to detect that your blood pressure has fallen. They're going to secrete renin, which begins an enzymatic cascade that takes an inactive component known as angiotensinogen and converts it into angiotensin II. Now, let's go back up here and look at the little flow chart. Okay, so the kidneys detect, that is a Y and an S, not a P. Okay, so the kidneys detect a fall in blood pressure. They secrete renin, which begins a pathway that leads to angiotensin II. Okay, angiotensin II has two primary actions. One, a quick action, vasoconstriction. You know by now what that's going to do. It's going to cause the tube to be little, smaller, so it increases blood pressure. Okay, that's short term. But it also has a long-term mechanism that it stimulates the adrenal glands. Primarily, or specifically, the adrenal cortex, which you'll learn about in the endocrine system, to secrete a hormone known as aldosterone. Aldosterone targets where, if you're going to affect volume? Yeah, you know, it's going to affect your kidneys. So let me erase this and we'll talk about how that works. All right, so we've secreted aldosterone because of this whole pathway with renin. Aldosterone works on these same structures, but it causes sodium-potassium pumps to be built all along the nephron. Okay? Sodium-potassium pumps. You should know by now that when sodium goes one way, potassium goes the other. Okay, so in this case, when we have aldosterone, and I'm going to write that up here just so we remember, aldosterone causes sodium-potassium pumps to be embedded in the nephron. Now, in this case, we're going to be pumping sodium out. Okay? So sodium is pumped out of the nephron and being resorbed back into the bloodstream. Now, what happens when sodium is pumped out of something? Of course, you know already, water follows. Okay? So if sodium's going out, you're going to have water coming out with it. Now, if water comes out, just like we talked about with antidiuretic hormone, the water is resorbed back into the bloodstream. So by putting these aldosterone, causing these sodium-potassium pumps to be built and embedded in the nephron. We pump sodium out, we pump water out, it's resorbed back into the bloodstream, blood volume goes up, blood pressure goes up. Man, I'm telling you, it's cool stuff. All right, now what happens in the other case? Blood pressure's too high. Those baroreceptors are being overstimulated. They send that information to the brain. The brain, excuse me, I want to make sure my notes are in place so we can talk about what we need to talk about. The brain is then going to stimulate what? It's not going to stimulate the cardioacceleratory center to action. We want to inhibit cardiac action, so the cardiac inhibitory action, or cardiac inhibitory center of the brain, will be stimulated. So several things are going to happen. We're going to start releasing all of these chemicals, one of which is atrial natriuretic peptide, abbreviated ANP. Atrial, that should alert you to something. You've heard of atria before, right? The two upper chambers in the heart. Okay, so your ANP is going to be secreted when your atrial receptors are pushed against too much, okay? The atria fill too much, so we're going to dump out ANP. ANP has two actions as well. Vasodilation. To dilate means to make bigger. So when you make that vessel bigger, the pressure within decreases. You're not changing the volume, you're changing the size of the tube, okay? It's also antagonistic to aldosterone. Aldosterone, right? Just talked about that. Okay? ANP causes us to retain potassium. Now, if we're retaining potassium, we are excreting sodium. Okay? So if we're keeping potassium, excreting sodium, what did we say about sodium and water? Where sodium goes, water goes, so we're going to be urinating out lots of sodium and lots of water. So what's happening there? Blood volume is decreasing. When blood volume decreases, blood pressure decreases. All right, the next ones we want to talk about just briefly are going to be responsible for vasodilation as well. So we have inflammatory chemicals such as histamine and prostaglandins that are going to vasodilate even further, cause some leaking of fluid out into body tissues. So it's leaking out of, when you vasodilate, the cells in the walls of the vessel are going to be pushed further apart, so more fluids are going to leak out of the vessels and into the extracellular spaces, out into your body tissues. So you're decreasing the fluid in that vessel, decreasing pressure. Nitric oxide is a very powerful vasodilator and very important. It is used in medications that are given for heart pain, for chest pain, because it causes vasodilation and increases the blood flow, the ease of the flow through the vessels. It's also very important because it's the primary chemical responsible for vasodilation leading to penile erection. That's right. You'll hear more about that in the reproductive system. And what about alcohol? Okay, now long-term, alcohol is going to increase blood pressure. But in the short term, alcohol inhibits antidiuretic hormone. Think about that word there. A diuretic causes you to produce more urine. Antidiuretic decreases urine output because we're saving all that water. So if alcohol keeps you from releasing ADH, then you're not retaining water. What are you doing? You're peeing it all out. If you've ever drank a beer or two, what happens? You drink one or two, you pee 6 or 8, right? That's because of the inhibition of antidiuretic hormone. You're not making aquaporins, you're not retaining that water, you're urinating it all out. And as you're urinating all that water out, your body's becoming dehydrated. As your body becomes dehydrated, you wake up the next morning with that yucky taste and dry mouth. You feel like crap because your body has dehydrated itself. You'll hear more about that too. All right, so last thing is just to look at a little schematic the way aldosterone works and the way that or the inhibition of aldosterone by ANP. Okay, so your atria detect increased pressure, secretes ANP. Your brain interprets it, okay, causes the ANP to be released. The ANP causes vasodilation, inhibits the release of aldosterone, so causes more sodium to be excreted, more water to be excreted, and the inhibition of renin, which of course leads to the inhibition of aldosterone. Okay. Alrighty, well, I think that's all I wanted to talk to you about. So hopefully you are now getting well versed in blood pressure and factors that affect it. And it's probably getting pretty close to time for a test. So be sure and ask your instructor if you have any questions. See you next time.